Welcome to another unrehearsed intellectual adventure with myself, David Didau, and the beautiful Martin Robinson. And today we're planning on having a chat about attention and intentionality and meaning. And just to get the ball rolling, we've selected another quotation for you. And this time it's from Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary. As we stand back, we can see the world as separate from ourselves, as something we can use, or as quite the opposite, as connected to ourselves more deeply. We can see others for the first time as beings like ourselves, the ground of empathy. And I'm going to go straight to Martin to start us off.
Okay. Right. What I like about that quote, if you like, put two, one of which is almost separate from the world, or we're part of the world. And to me, this is the crucial relationship between how we approach teaching. Are we teaching vessels that are completely separate to us, or part of what we're doing? And it's a subtle difference, but actually I think it's quite an enormous difference. Where I'm interested in starting is from the idea of attention and looking out into the world, and starting from where you were talking about, I think on a research ed talk or something like that, about attention. And McGilchrist's sort of two ideas around it. And I quite like his idea around the bird and the worm. So we've got let's call it a robin, as my name's Robinson. So a robin,
and I'm redhead.
Picking at a worm. Yeah, redhead. There you go, Sissy. And so he's a little robin, and he's, yeah. Well, I didn't want to even mention that. So we've got the little robin, and they're picking a worm, and it's very focused on that worm there. But also it has another focus, which is sort of worldly focus, when it's picking this worm, but it also has to check to see what else might be happening around it. Maybe an eagle coming down to swoop at the robin, for example. So the two sort of forms of attention in this case, the absolute specific detail of the more general perception of what's going on around it, and the switch between the two. And I really like that image.
Yes,
about how we pay attention to the world.
And as McGilchrist explains it, is that because of our biology, it's not really possible for us to maintain focus on both of those things simultaneously, that they impede each other, and that by focusing on something close up, it becomes harder for us to maintain an awareness, a broader vigilance of the world. And that I think how this might play out in a classroom situation, especially I remember being, when I was a newly forged teacher, and I would go into the classroom with my copious notes on what I was going to teach, and my attention was on myself and what I wanted to communicate, and the ideas I wanted to explain, and what I wanted children to do, and as a result of my attention being where it was, I had very little left to spare for the meaning that they were making of what I was trying to teach them. And so they would have been making sense of it, almost certainly not the sense that I dreamt they were making. But as we become more experienced and more confident, the act of teaching can become something that we're less conscious of. We have more of a subsidiary awareness of. It becomes backgrounded, and we become more able to foreground the grappling between ourselves and the children, and the ideas and the meaning that they're making between that relationship.
Okay. That's an interesting thing. I mean, if your focus is on yourself as a teacher, should it actually not be on yourself, what you're doing, the techniques you're using? Should it actually be more so on what you're teaching and the responses you're getting back?
Yeah, well, that's the point I'm making. I think if,
At the beginning, I know the focus on technique and using, doing this, doing that, but actually, should it be more? I don't know. I'm
sorry, I'm not sure if our audience will have heard that because you descended into.
Did I? Oh,
Repeat
sorry.
that last point.
It's not my fault.
No, of course.
Technology. Should it be more? Should it be more on what you're teaching? So, your teaching, and are they grappling with it? Are the kids grappling with this thing I'm teaching here, or should it be more on the technique of teaching?
Well, I think should is besides the point, because speaking for myself, I was so concerned with getting it right and seeing it go wrong that it was almost impossible for me to not have the attention on myself and you know, trying to you know, that I would do these realms of preparation and trying to sort of memorize notes and this sort of thing and so it may be, of course, it would have been better had my attention not been so directed, but I didn't feel that was possible at that point. And maybe, you know, maybe there's a case or an argument to make that this is something we can deliberately and intentionally help teachers to become more aware of the world outside themselves, the space outside themselves. But it's really difficult. And I remember an experience of working with a young trainee English teacher, and so he was watching me teach. And one of the things he said to me after a lesson, he said, "I've noticed that that you wander around the classroom, and you know that you sometimes you're here and sometimes you're there, and you know, why do you do that?" And I said, "I don't know. I've never really thought about it. I've no idea why I do that. I don't know." Anyway, the next lesson, he obviously had decided that this was the thing to do, and so he decided, you know, he'd obviously consciously decided to stand at different and wander around the classroom in different ways, and it was really distracting and irritating for the students who were like, "What the fuck is he doing?" And there's something really interesting. It made me think there's something really interesting about this, that because by that point in my career, my attention was much more on how the students are extracting and making meaning out of the ideas that I'm presenting them with, and how are they grappling, and what understandings are they coming to, what's the sort of sense that they're making. And I can only assume that my movement around the classroom was in some way in support of that, and that maybe I would stand near somebody because I felt that there might be some benefit to them from that happening. But because he was copying where my subsidiary awareness was, the thing that I wasn't conscious of, and consciously copying it went wrong. And I ended up saying to him, I put a sellotaped an X on the floor at the center of the room, you know, the front center, and said, "Master the X. And once you've mastered standing still, then we can release you into the rest of the room."
Then you can wander around a bit more.
Exactly.
When you're looking at the things you're saying, subsidiarity there, subsidiarity. What do you mean by that?
Okay. So this is an idea that Michael Polanyi talks about, and he says that, you know, when we're acting on the world, when we're extracting meaning, whenever we're, so for instance, if I'm writing, then my subsidiary awareness as somebody who knows already how to write is on the pen and on the movement of my hand across the paper and those sorts of things. But my focus is on the meaning that I'm trying to convey. You know, if I've got a bit of food trapped between my teeth, and I use my tongue to try and dislodge the morsel of food, my attention is on where the food is, and my subsidiary awareness is on my tongue. And one of the things that he talks about with this subsidiary awareness is it's almost always tacit. It's because we've not directed the kind of intense focus on it, the left brain focus that McGilchrist talks about in his work. Then we don't have the ability to reason and argue what it is that we're doing, because we're not really aware of it. We're only aware of the thing that we're directing our gaze onto.
Right. You've also said left brain there, which will cause people to recoil.
Yes.
So do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So, well, obviously I think that I always get the sides of the brain mixed up. But one side of the brain, left brain, I think, is associated with the logical capacities that we have, and the right side is associated with the more sort of creative and artistic sides. And there's a popular piece of misinformation that you can either be left-brained or right-brained, and that means you're either logical or creative, and that's bollocks. That being logical, being creative, or being anything requires both of our hemispheres to act together. And I don't know enough about neurobiology to make any support for any of these observations. But what McGilchrist talks about is that we've developed this brain which is divided into these two separate hemispheres, and the division in the human brain seems more pronounced than in most other brains. And so our hemispheres are connected by this thin bridge of fibres, the corpus callosum, which cause the hemispheres to act in concert. But the division and the connection, the bridge, seems designed, it appears to be designed for one side of the brain to inhibit and impede awareness of the other side. So that when
there's the people who've had for epilepsy mainly, wasn't it? The brain cut in two, yes. Shall we say, through that one side of the brain, for instance, does control language.
Yes,
because they couldn't speak about things at all that happened. So they do things like them on the screen, one side looking at something over there, and then one side looking over there, and getting to do some side, and this side can't explain what's going on.
Detail of it, but there'll be things where they'll get one eye to read a piece of text, and then with the other side of the brain, the bit controlled by the other side of the brain, to write down what you saw. And people don't know. They kind of, but they get an impression. They have a sense without any detail, and they sort of write down imagined ideas about what the other side of their brain perceived.
Yeah.
You can get things.
Now we're going off. We're getting into a lot of detail here.
Yeah.
And I'm still. So I haven't got the bigger picture of this thing that's going on here. So the attention, going back to the bird. The robin, so looking at one thing in detail, and then the idea as well of some sort of things you're really focused on and you can think about. But if you're writing, learning to write, it might be the mechanics of using the pen and the paper.
Yes.
But if you've mastered writing, then you're thinking more about the content of what you're writing. I can think, right, because I can do that without focusing too much on that. I'm quite interested in attention in terms of memory as well. So I'll throw this one at you, which is a normal everyday occurrence for me and quite a few people, which is coming home, putting my keys down, and then sort of doing various things around the house, and then going out and can't find my keys. And this sort of thing, like, because I didn't put them in the right place, or I just threw them down somewhere. I didn't. So attention also has an important part of memory, doesn't it? Isn't it the main way into a memory?
There's that lovely poetic quote from Daniel Willingham that memory is the residue of thought, that the things that you think about and by inference, the things that you attend to are the things that you remember. And I think one of the sort of one of the things that's overlooked about the concept of attention often is that in order to attend something, you've got to withdraw your attention on something else. So that you come home and you're excited or you're angry and you throw down your keys and you tell the people at home, oh, you won't believe what happened to me today. Your attention is so invested on that level that you have no awareness of what you did with your keys, unless, you know, as you were sort of hinting at, unless you've got a routine that you always put your keys in a particular place. And I, you know, like you, if I'm quite good at putting my keys in the usual place, but on the occasions I forget, it's a sad day. And
I think there's been a bit of research into people who live in chaos. They put anything anywhere, and people who are absolutely disciplined are putting the same thing with routine in the same place. But when the person who's the routine person, their keys, it's a real difficult thing to contend with, because they're just so used to doing everything right that when it doesn't, their whole world sort of collapses around them, you know. But the chaotic person just accepts it. They just know they're not going to find their keys for some time, and they tend to find them quite happily at some point, you know.
Maybe. I don't know whether they. I don't know what it's. I think, like most of us, don't we sort of hold our tendencies for chaos and order in balance? And you know, I have a sort of chaotic filing system with, you know, where books are, and I have sort of a memory of where I put things rather than any. And if that memory is faulty, then I'm in trouble and I can't find what I'm looking for, because I've got a strong visual memory of it looked like this and it was here, and then it turns up somewhere completely different. I don't know.
Chaos and order is a sort of classic. Is it Jungian or something? I don't know, but it's sort of classic balance of things that go on in life. I don't know if it's all held in by every person in the same way. I've got no idea. If I was
no, but so just to return us doggedly to the classroom situation, I think that one of the things that you know, I become aware of, I notice in looking at debates about education, is that there's a lot of discussion and debate about instruction, how to get children to learn most efficiently, how to get them to remember efficiently and effectively, and less focus perhaps on what it is that you're doing. And the idea of teaching is kind of meaningless. You have to be teaching something. And we talked about this at the end of our last discussion, and I made I used an image from David Holbrook, who talks about the difference between the finger pointing and the object being pointing, that you're pointing at, and that teaching is the act of pointing, and the purpose of teaching is the thing that you're wanting people to see. And I think one of the potential difficulties with having our attention on instruction, or one aspect of instruction, you know, how we're improving the scientific rigor of our teaching techniques, then the danger becomes that possibly we impede or block our awareness of what's out there.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
I think it's hugely. And going back to it being a technique, I think teaching, not as a profession but as a thing, is probably one of the first acts of socialization, if you like, that humankind took all those years ago. And I think, you know, I look at you, you look at me, we then point at something and look over at it, and then sort of share some nods and grunts or whatever about that thing. It's like, I don't know, it must be Carry On Cave People or something like that. It's probably a movie somewhere, but that kind of moment is actually crucial to the act of what I would call intentionality, but I think it's quite important. But just before I get to that, this whole thing about instruction, which is an important part of teaching.
For sure.
And I wouldn't denigrate it, but it's very much a one unidirectional thing. It goes in, and then we test if it's there through various, quizzing or whatever. Is it right? Is it right? Have they got it? Have they got it? Can they do it? Can they practice it? Have they done it? Bang. And that's absolutely has its place, but it's not what I would call an education or full education or a fully rounded education, because of what it misses out. And that is the intentional gaze. That, in other words, the pupil, the person being taught, is actually looking at you. They have a role within that. It's not just it's them looking at what being taught at them and then having an attitude towards that. Can you put something about intentionality up? Because I think we've got a quote about what it is.
I will in just one moment. But as you said that, I think, there's a danger as well that currently of, there's a risk and a cost with the move towards looking at curriculum. And lots of us are doing lots of work on the curriculum, and Ofsted are having a look at the curriculum. And I think there's the same danger with instruction as there is with curriculum. That if all your attention is on what am I going to teach and not on what sense are they going to make, how are they going to interpret, what's the significance of this, then we run the same kind of risk. But so on the subject of intentionality, we have another something that we prepared earlier for you, which I'm just going to put up on the screen. And it is this quotation from Dan Zahavi that says, the idea that consciousness is characterized by being of or about or directed at something. And that's what you meant by intentionality, isn't it?
Yeah. So if I am looking at, let's just can I get back on the screen there? I can't, there we go. So here I am, here's a glass. Yeah. So I'm looking at this is the glass, what's in it. You're probably guessing it's water. I don't know.
It's probably gin.
I know what's in it. I know the weight of it. But the way I see this glass, I mean, if this was basic physics, I mean, it could be it's waves, it's particles. I don't know. There's at the human level, we see it, and I know it as a glass. Perhaps you've never seen this sort of vessel before in your life, and I'm sort of teaching it to you and trying to explain it to you, but you're looking at it as completely, what the hell's that? So the way you see it, the way you perceive it is part of it itself. So I look at it, glass, I just take that for granted. In fact, it's a bit like you were saying earlier about it becomes part of the, what was it, subsidiary look upon the world. Yeah, so I don't even notice it, I just take part of it, and it doesn't even focus in on me. But then if you make something of it, then I focus in on it. I say it's blue and all those things, right? So the way you see something is part of the thing itself. So the intentionality is the relationship between the thing, in this case the glass, and you perceiving the glass. Yeah. So if I teach you a poem, it's not just a one-way idea. I don't just say, here's a poem, this is what you think about it, this is what you say about it. I've also got to take into account the way you see the poem that I'm teaching you, that you hear the poem I'm teaching you, or read the poem I'm teaching you. You might have a completely different perspective, either through a lot of knowledge about it or through complete ignorance of it, but it doesn't really matter. You still have an angle on it that we have to take into account. It's bringing those two things together that, to me, is the art of teaching. It's bringing, it is an intentional act. It's to say, it's a communal intentionality. So intentionality is not just the individual, it's how we all then come together and say, oh, look over there. So it's back to the pointing. It's me pointing, and then someone else goes, oh yeah, and then someone else points, and we're all pointing. We're seeing it slightly differently, but we're coming to some sort of slow agreement as to perhaps a bit of disagreement about what that thing might be we're looking at. Go on.
it's also true, I think, perhaps that we learn very, very quickly, very young, that that one of the qualities of your glass, if you could hold that up for us again, is we look at the glass and we know, or we perceive, we intuit that it has no will, no life of its own. It can be used, but it's not. It doesn't have. It can contain water or gin in your case, obviously, but it has. We can't interact with it beyond a relatively narrow set of things. But we have a very different intuition about living things. And one of the things I remember becoming really aware of quite young was that our family dog. You'd see a squirrel or something, and you point to the squirrel, going, "Look," and the dog's going, and it just looks at the finger. It doesn't. So we learn fairly quickly that some living things don't interact in quite the same way that other people like us do, and that we have that quality of not looking at the finger but looking where the finger's pointing, and we can share that, and we can recognise it in each other. And that there's something important about children in a classroom becoming, their awareness of that becoming broader and wider. And when the one of the classic breakdowns for communication in an English classroom is that you show students some poetry which is distant from them, something a bit more alien. You show them a piece of a Shakespeare text, and it's unfamiliar, and it has odd spellings and strange syntax, and all of their awareness is on the oddness and the unfamiliarity and the alienness, and it's difficult to see past that. But with enough perseverance and with enough artful pointing and sense making, they can learn to go past that barrier and put that the text, the reading becomes more of a subsidiary awareness, and that they can focus on meaning, and they can recognize that the people that lived in these times and places are like us. They're not like us, but they're like us, and they share similar goals and ambitions, but not quite the same. And the learning, that idea that we saw in the first quotation about empathy, the ground of empathy. I remember early in my career as a teacher, teaching Romeo and Juliet, and I was teaching it to a group of year 9 students who were not predisposed to enjoy Shakespeare. And we got to the point in the play where Romeo's been banished, and he's gone to see Friar Lawrence, and do you know this bit? He's in tears, he's crying, he's carrying on, and I turned to my students and I said, what's Romeo experiencing here? Why do we think he's behaving in this way? And one of the lads in the class, looking sort of a bit puzzled and confused, he said, I don't really understand why he's behaving like that, because if that happened to me, I would move in with my nan in Bridgewater. and for him, he could empathise with the emotions, he could empathise at the level of that, but what he couldn't do at that point is he wasn't able to think himself, because he didn't know enough, into the mind of an Elizabethan for whom travel is dangerous and unpredictable, and the walled city of Verona represents the universe, and leaving that means leaving everything you've ever known, and moving in with a convenient relative is not something that's going to be possible, and that learning that level of empathy is perhaps part of this idea of intentionality.
Yeah, I think there's also something there. You mentioned the word mind, which to me takes us even further into intentionality, but move Heidegger. Every time I mention Heidegger, I have to point out he was quite a difficult person, shall we say, in that his certain proclivities politically and all that. But perhaps that's part of what I'm about to say. But the mind is not the same as when we talk about things like the brain, and this is, so if we get into phenomenology, this idea is that you see the inside and the outside at the same time. So the mind is inside and outside. So the mind of an Elizabethan is different than the mind of us in the 21st century or whatever.
Because of their
our minds are slightly different. Yeah, because we are there. So Dasein, as Heidegger would call it, is their being there. Yeah. We are of the world in which we're in, the culture we're in at the moment. So our thinking is shaped unconsciously and consciously by the world in which we're in. So, you know, this is glass, you know, and you take it quite happily that it's glass. We've got a shared understanding of the way things are. At the moment, we're in lockdown. If you say lockdown to an Elizabethan, it's probably got a totally different meaning that it would have now, or whatever. Yeah. So he can live with his nan quite happily now. So getting into the mind, a different mindset, all these things. So where is thought becomes quite an interesting point, you know. So thought is not inside there. Thought part of the world in which we're in. And this sort of relationship between us and world, being enworlded, is part of an education tool, if you like, to think, well, we're actually in the moment that we're in, and then saying, right, so if we imagine the mind of an Elizabethan, it's going to be different. The whole world around structures in a slightly different way. Just as look at an animal, a dog, the brain of the dog, yes, and the world in which it focuses on and what's interesting to it, and its body in that world, you know, makes it have a different mind to us. And obviously our conscious mind is perhaps more, I use the words ways, but I think the dog has more sophistication in other ways. But perhaps, you know, sort of intellectually, academically, I don't know the word to dog, but we are obviously of a different mindset to dog. Now, the pupils in your classroom, the world in which they are brought up and they inhabit, how to get into that world and bring them into another, and to be able to be mobile between those worlds, and we can be open to them, is what I would call cultural mobility and all those things. But that's part of the job of the teacher, is to say, here are different mindsets, ways of seeing. And I'm not talking growth mindset, for God's sake, but you know, there are different ways of being in this world, and here's a way, here's another way, here's another way, and let's be mobile between those things, and accept that I think, you know, moving into lockdown it's been quite stressful for quite a lot of people. It's a different way of being in the world, you know, and it does affect the environment in which you're in, really affects the way that you feel about yourself and see the world and understand the world.
Sure. Yeah, the experiences that we've had over the last 6-7 weeks are going to be extraordinarily different for every individual because of the circumstances they found them in. So, you know, at the sharp end, the people working in emergency rooms are going to have a very, very different memory and experience than I've had, and somebody living in without any outdoor space with only a window onto the world, you can absolutely see how that would be a much more confining and harder experience to make sense of, perhaps. I'm fortunate in that I've got lots of wooded countryside just outside my door. I can have the illusion that I'm still taking part in the world, but that's harder to maintain, perhaps, in a more urban environment. Anyway,
it's interesting as well, the physical space as well, that we're having to occupy physically, the space in which we're in, but also when we go out and venture, we've got to sort of avoid people and sort of move around them at a certain distance, you know, and perhaps sometimes you just look away, but sometimes you sort of acknowledge each other and nod and smile.
Yes, and other people, ways, you know, the act of going to a shop to buy bread and milk, the other people are threatening in a way which they weren't in the past, and our interactions with them are more cautious and you know, our concerns about their intentions are different to the way they were.
Yeah, or or knowing it's not there, they don't necessarily want to be a threat, but they might be, you know, this sort of
sure.
hidden threat.
Went on a walk. It's completely off topic. I took the dog for a walk the other day, and up into the field near where I live, and there's some people sunbathing, and as I approached, they became aware of me and started doing sit-ups and sort of showing that they were doing exercise and not just lounging about. Because
were you just about to phone 999?
I was just about to, get my drone on them, and but clearly their perception was that that me as another human being entering that space is that will make a judgment, and that judgment might be negative of their intentions, and that's strange and new, and something that we're not we're not sure how to make sense of. My mum told me last night that she's going to a BE Day party today, and my response was to what are you doing? But I don't know what I haven't got the details, but she's going to a socially distant BE Day party. More on that later.
Is that? I'm not sure if that's allowed. Is it? I don't know. Is that in the rules? I suppose specifically, there's nothing about VE Day parties in the rules.
I don't know. I fear that. Certainly.
Yeah. It sounds a bit dubious to me. So let's go back to the classroom and just go back to that instructional approach, and then a more well, I call it wisdom, pursuit of wisdom, or something like that. So the two things I add to knowledge. So knowledge is vital. Teaching knowledge is vital. All those things. But then to me, the two things, if you look up what wisdom is, it adds to knowledge, and knowledge is important, but experience is important, and judgment is important. But those three things sort of hold equal weight. Now, whether you can actually ever arrive at wisdom, I doubt. I don't think we ever become wise. We can sort of go in that trajectory, but I don't think we reach that. But experience is, sorry, say it again.
We can become more wise.
Yeah, one would hope.
I aspire to be as wise as you.
Very good. But experience becomes an important part of it, but judgment. And I think we talked about this a bit, about developing a palate, about developing taste, about developing opinions, beliefs, thoughts, and actually sort of becoming aware through experience, but also be able to make choices at various levels. So there's your personal choice, but there's also the community of minds choice, the wider people as a whole, or different groupings, whatever they happen to be, come together and choose those things.
And this is one of the difficulties.
And that's part of.
This is one of the difficulties with the act of teaching, because we can teach certain kinds of knowledge. We can give children facts. We can show them processes which they can practice. But it's very difficult for us to see the causal relationship between the information, the act of teaching, and wisdom, or even the causal relationship between the teaching we're doing and judgment. Judgment arguably is a product of your knowledge and your experiences, and for us to see our way into that is probably impossible. But yet it still has this idea of being beguilingly straightforward for us to go, well, the reason they're able to do that is because of something I did, or because this happened, they are now able to. And that's probably false. Sometimes.
Yeah, it's got to be a conversation, it's got to be a relationship, and all those things. I mean, we come into it as they are part of the world we are part of. And we come to it with slightly different schema, but some shared schema within that at a level in which we're getting involved in. But we don't have always a direct relationship to what comes out. Though sometimes, other things, we might have a bigger role to play. But what those things are is very difficult to ascertain. And I don't think a pupil would necessarily ascertain it either.
Right.
This is where customer surveys come at the end of term. You have to put smiley face or sad face or whatever. I don't think you can even do this about teachers. You get a certain level. if the teacher keeps hitting you, you can, you know, you say you don't like that necessarily, but you can't necessarily talk about the quality of an education
There's very
as a one teacher.
And this is an issue with the whole way we think about and perceive causality. And at this, you know, before we get on to that, I'm just going to indulge myself by showing you a little animation that I've made. So I'm going to share the screen again and go to back to the desktop. And the Belgian philosopher Albert Michot said that we can't actually, we can never see causes. All that we can see is effects. And he did various bits of experimentation where he would show people animations and ask them for their explanations, and people would confabulate stories. And I've just got a very simple little animation here, which shows a purple ball rushing across the screen, making contact with the orange ball. I'll just do it for you again, just in case you missed that. There it is. And the question is, what causes the orange ball to move? And the temptation, the inviting answer is to say, well, the purple ball collided with it, and the impact of its, you know, from its momentum, it caused the movement, and that's physics. But there are no balls. They're just circles on a screen. They have no physical substance. The cause is I've pressed a button on a keyboard, and that if you show the same animation at a slower speed, we no longer believe that the movement of the purple ball caused the movement of the orange ball. That the speed of the movement was what convinced us that we'd seen a cause. And you know, I've certainly had this experience in a classroom situation where somebody has decided to come in and just check what I'm doing, and they've come into my classroom and they've watched some of my lesson, and afterwards they've said, well, let me explain why it all went wrong, and or they'll say something like, you know, that, you know, they'll make a judgment, and their belief will be, I've seen an effect, I've seen something which is indisputable happen, and what's more, I know what caused that. I know what made that happen, and the belief that we know what makes things happen is it's hard for us to get. And this is, you know, it goes back to the point about when our focus, when our attention is on the act of teaching or on the content that we're teaching, then you know, the belief will be perhaps, you know, I used Rosenshine's principles in instruction to communicate this information, and they learned it because I've been employing this evidence-based mechanism, and that may or may not be true.
Right. I mean, and then there's the, I've got to throw something else at you, which we should perhaps call it. I mean, the Jon Snow story. You know, Jon Snow, not the Channel 4 news reader, but the going back to Soho and trying to find out why everyone's getting cholera, and so there's this tap water pump in Soho, and he saw a lot of cholera around, and he had no idea why everyone's getting cholera, and you know, it's getting worse and worse. And then they found a woman who lived, a well-to-do woman in Hampstead, who also got cholera. And he sort of said, well, how did this happen? You know, what's the cause of her getting cholera? And he sort of asked her, and she said, well, he asked about her drinking habits and things like that. And she said, well, I've moved from Soho, but I still like the water from Soho. So she was getting delivered to her every day or every week or whatever, water from Soho, because she liked the taste of it. And of course, that's how she got cholera. So there you go. There's a straightforward causal impact that he then goes, right, this is it. So it's this pump, this is the problem. And then sort of, you know, and I think the pump is there, and the pub next to it now is called the Jon Snow. So if you ever go to Soho, right, there you go, you get the whole story. Because some things causally,
the belief of the causal relationship before that was that illnesses like cholera were caused by bad air, weren't they? Miasma.
That's it. Yeah. So we can be completely wrong, but with a simple causal link.
Yeah.
And that's it. Some things are more simple than others. And perhaps, I don't know if teaching is ever that simple. It's because it takes place in such a bigger event, which is who we are, where we are, what we're teaching, what we're looking at, or, you know, the socio-economic background, all these, there's so many variables, as people say. It's very difficult to pinpoint one cause at any particular moment. You know, it'd be much nicer if it was one cause.
Yeah.
But is there not moments of little improvements and things like that you can make?
Oh, well, of course there are, and I think probably it's probably true to say when children know less about a subject or are younger, you know, you can more clearly understand or approximate the causal relationship. So if a child has no experience of orthography and you show them the relationship between sounds and spellings, then you can be reasonably confident that your teaching had an impact on their ability then to read. And that seems to be a fairly straight, it's unlikely that they're going to have picked that up elsewhere. They might, but it's probable that your input was causal there. But I think that, you know, that when we come, and I'll go back to the example that you gave earlier of teaching an interpretation of a poem, and we say this is what it means. And you know, that on one level, especially, you know, children are studying for an exam and they might go, well, okay, that's what I'll write in my exam. But whether we've caused them to think that, or whether we've caused them to think this is just what you do in an exam situation, or none of the above, is more complex, I think.
So this is where it comes to the impact that measurement has,
right,
in education, which we can, if we can easily measure it, we can easily teach to it, but that's not necessarily the education that the kids need generally. Yeah. It might be for that specific thing, but if we then completely focus, you know, let's have a 5-year GCSE program or something like that on passing the exam, we actually might be reducing their education, but improving their grades.
Yeah. Do you want,
and we can say, this is what we've done.
Say something about your idea of a T-shaped model for teaching.
Okay, yeah, So, well, it's not my idea. It's a classic idea, which is depth and breadth. So the horizontal line at the top of the T is breadth and context, putting things within context, and the vertical line is depth, sort of studying things in depth. Now, I sort of took that and turned it into a triangle that way as well. I was constantly aware when I was starting off, I was doing a lot of teaching what I call at the point of the triangle. These are the bits that get you the grades in the exam. If you answer the question in this way, this is absolutely to the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the assessment AO1, AO2, and all these things there you can actually do. So what I started to realize, talking to the kids about their work, and they had to apply their knowledge to up-to-date things. So they had to, number one, they had to create theatre, and they had to go to theatre and become a critic and write about it. And what came clear to me was I was having to do a lot of the work telling them what they were seeing. In other words, they weren't seeing it. I was seeing it and telling them what to write in order to get the grades. So my thinking then, rather than teaching them more and more about the point and just being happy with this, was to say, well, what they need is more breadth, more top of the triangle, which is the context of things, and also looking at other things around it. So I'd give you one example of this. We used to teach just one theatre practitioner, which is all you needed for the exam. So we used to teach Bertolt Brecht. Now, in the same amount of time that it took to teach Bertolt Brecht, I then added Konstantin Stanislavski and Antonin Artaud. So we're looking at three people in the time it took to look at one. But because they're comparing, contrasting, and thinking and getting a broader reality about things, they started to be able to see more and understand more about what they were thinking about. And also with that, we put it into context. What is it, the way that these three people have in common, the way they look at truth, the way they look at the world. So you had, right, this is, Brecht looks at it, Stanislavski looks at the world. This is a real thing. You know, the way you see it, we want it on the stage in that way. We want it to look real, if you like. Brecht said, no, it's not real at all. There's something going on there, which is our relationship to the means of production, a good Marxist sort of argument. So we want to alienate you and make you look at the world as though it's a strange thing, so you come to critique it. And we have that different way. So truth is a social truth. So there's what it looks like as a truth, and then a social truth. And Artaud was, no, puts all that away and says, no. It's a spiritual thing. It's how you feel. It's an emotional thing. So it gets rid of language almost and just gets rid of the stage. He gets rid of boom and just noises and movements and the concrete language of the stage, various other things that do it there. So you put those three things together, they start to see the wider picture, and they started to write better. And I had to do less at the point of the triangle by giving them more early on, like holding on to their bike or whatever. You know, I helped them at the beginning by getting them to see more, and then yes, help them with the language that they might need to tick the points. But then the triangle becomes quite useful into putting things in context and then writing in depth, thinking about that. And also the steps between context to this bit of context to this bit of context of that, yeah. Which is the Russian dolls metaphor, which is every bit of knowledge can fit inside something else, and you get to the little point at the end. Yeah. So it's full of mixed metaphors and everything.
Sure. But and there is a good of something.
You asked.
No. There's a really good example of where you can be reasonably confident about a causal relationship, because if they don't know anything about Stanislavski, why would you? And how can they be expected to think about Stanislavski? So you tell them something, you show them something, and then you can say, now look, you know, you've seen that. Now you're seeing something completely different. You're seeing somebody stepping out of the fourth wall and tearing down a barrier. What does that make you think? And then you can be reasonably sure that at least some of the thoughts they're having are as a result of you showing them something they didn't know about before. And in that sense,
it's also because
knowledge.
Yeah, so they can make judgment, but also what you've got to try and do is, the majority of kids in those days when I was teaching it, their experience of theatre was very limited in East London. So what they knew of theatre was pantomime and also television and film. And so they knew EastEnders. And EastEnders, you can say, well, let's put that in terms of Stanislavski. So they've got their way in. So you're helping their way in. Pantomime, to some extent, you can say, well, there's Brechtian elements here.
Yes.
And also you can start talking about other ways of seeing. So the fact you've got this looks different than this helps them come into the picture. Yeah, it does look different. They're doing different things. Right, now I'm going to give you a language to explain how those things are different. So you have your way into it. You have your experiences. Now let's get into a point of judging what the difference is between the two. And then perhaps an aesthetic sort of judgment about where does it work in this context? What works best and those other things.
And taste. Did it do it for you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does it work? Yeah. But then should it work for you as well? I mean, are they, the idea that your taste is good because it's your opinion is as a teacher, I've always had to battle against with kids. It's my opinion, isn't it? So therefore it's right. Yeah, but you know, your opinions are not necessarily right. So I think you have to have this sort of edge to you as a teacher.
Yes. So there's an interesting relationship, I think, between breadth and depth, that the pursuit of children's journey through schooling, through education, to ever-increasing exam levels, is that they go deeper and deeper into subjects, but the ability to perceive and make judgments in depth is probably made impossible by not having sufficient breadth. You need the breadth of shallow experiences in order to be able to make sense of the world in greater depth. And that,
I think, and it's that going back to the bird and the worm, and that if we're constantly just tugging at the worm, we don't We don't see anything in context, and we don't see the danger of that either. You know, the eagle comes and swoops us up, you know, at some point, because we haven't even thought about things in the wider context. I think also it's an interesting thing about not all subjects necessarily work in that way. I don't know, but there is a way of, you said about we start off with breadth and get, I don't know if we do in a lot of subjects, it's just one damn thing after another. A lot of teaching it's depth all the way, just these little things, especially if you're doing a scheme of works, scheme of work, then this scheme of work, then this scheme of work. It's all about volcanoes and something else and something else, and it's hardly ever at the point of looking it together.
Well, to the extent that might be true, that's probably to a subject's detriment. It's probably a barrier to children being able to make sense of that. And if all, you know, so you mentioned there about volcanoes and you know, various geographical features. Is if you're studying geographical features in depth, but you have not really much of a concept that the world changes as a result of interaction with the elements slowly over time, and more quickly with humanity's relationship with the world, then you're never going to get, without that sort of breadth of understanding, you're never going to get some of the depth that you're exposed to. It's always going to be abstracted to a point that it's going to be difficult for you to make sense of. And the other thing that I'm groping towards something here. I don't know if it's at all correct, but it strikes me that providing children with breadth is something where it's potentially more straightforward to be confident about the causal relationship between what we're doing and what they might be experiencing, because you know, we can be, do you know this? No? Okay, let me tell you some more stuff. And when it comes to depth, then it's probably, when it comes to judgment and when it comes to taste and connecting things together and saying, well, you know, my view is based upon all of these different things, then it's much harder to know what the effect that you're having is. And increasingly you have to leave some of that to trust. I mean, you made the point about, you know, you're supplying some of the language in order to help them, you know, hit the tick boxes. But and you know, those are points where you can see the relationship between your input and the output. But it's superficial, and I think a lot of the danger that certainly I've, you know, reflected on with some of the teaching that I've done over the past is that when I've excuse me, focused on giving students the language to explain their points, giving them structures, giving them things like the point, evidence, explain, paragraph structure, that's relatively easy to copy. It's the beauty, the strength of it is that children can see that and they go, oh yeah, I can make mine look more like that. And because we see the ease with which that can be transferred from me to you, then we practice that. Let's practice writing these sorts of paragraphs over and over again. And I think that what can happen very easily is that children almost develop the ability to write cargo cult essays, where they're copying the form and the structure. At a distance, it looks a bit like an essay, but if you get close to it, you realise it's made out of bamboo and twigs, and you know the planes aren't going to land at the bamboo airports, and that in order to get the planes to land, they need that interaction of breadth with depth and expression. I imagine in your terms, you know, that's the finishing point. That's your ideas of.
Sorry,
that's okay. It's you know the idea of their rhetorical flourish. That there's something that, you know, if we're practicing the wrong things, they'll get good at the wrong things. Getting good at the wrong things doesn't make you good. It makes you.
And this comes back, but it comes back to this thing that in order to get the grade, you have to do this is what you have to do to get the grade, and that becomes the cynical point of education, that the reason we're here for 13 years of our life is just to get the grade to go on to the next thing, and that becomes well, you know, is it worth 13 years for that? I don't know if it is. I'm sure you could get that quicker.
It's especially not worth
or
it
you know,
if you've got to your 13th year or your 11th year and there is no exam.
Well, that's it. Take it away and make up, and your mark will be based on a few bell curves here and there that sort of work it out. Oh, you'll be there probably. Yeah.
Well, it does something, doesn't it? It makes the causal effect, the causal relationship between the grade and the process. It makes it sort of more transparently absurd.
Yeah, it's lovely, actually. I mean, at some point, you can actually take the pupil out of the thing entirely.
Yeah. Well, you know,
just have the data points.
There's a really high degree of correlation between an IQ test at the age of 11 and A-level results at the age of 18. So you just IQ test them at 11, and we'll predict their grades, and they don't worry about the rest of it.
And if that is it, then of course it doesn't matter what they know over that time. I mean, you know, you don't have to teach them this stuff if it's just about the output. I mean, it's a very cynical view, but at some point, is it Brian Kaplan or what is it, who wrote
the Case Against Education? Yeah, Brian Kaplan.
Sorry,
Brian Kaplan. Case Against Education.
Yeah. So yeah, even makes the point. You know, the only point of education should be a sort of vocational one, if anything. You know, and tied into that whole world, it's a more honest way of approaching it, or all those things. So it should be instruction, if you like, instruction in sort of vocational point of view, and the other sort of more liberal approaches to education are probably a waste of time, apart from those of a certain class or whatever he gets into, I think, and we can get our education from going to the opera and reading books and things like that.
As Kaplan sort of has the grace to point out, I'm a professor, so I've benefited from all of this education, but most of you won't, so why bother?
Yes, he's very, it is a slightly bad taste in the mouth about that, you know, there are only certain sophisticates who can actually have that education, you know, but it's certainly an argument.
Well, and that's something that we should return to next time. Who is education for? And thank you, Martin Robinson, for being a feast for the eyes as well as the mind. And we'll see you hopefully next time. Thanks very much.
Take care. Thank you.